Welcome. Very pleased to have you with us here today for our 41st episode of This Is CDR. This Is CDR is an online event series presented by Open Air to explore the range of carbon dioxide removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals Open Air is working to advance in New York and other US states and jurisdictions, as well as in Europe. Everyone, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. My name is Toby Bryce, based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work on CDR policy advocacy and market development with Open Air. Just some quick background on Open Air. We're a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of carbon removal solutions essential to solving the climate crisis. We're a growing global community, and we work together on open source missions in the areas of policy advocacy, R&D, and activist CDR business and market development. There should be a link in the chat to a form where you can sign up to join our group, and we'd love to have you. Just some quick background before we get started on CDR. Most of you who are here today are familiar, but this is the IPCC and also the CDR primer definition of CDR, which is a purposeful human activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and to durably store it in geologic, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. When we talk about CDR, as we're doing today and with the series, it's really critical to emphasize first and foremost that CDR is in no way, shape, or form a substitute for emissions reductions. We must quickly and rapidly reduce emissions as quickly as possible and decarbonize the global economy, full stop. That said, there's clear scientific consensus, including in very stark terms in last week's and recent IPCC AR6WG3 report, that CDR will be required at gigaton scale, that's billions of tons per year by mid-century, to counteract those emissions that are difficult or inequitable to abate, and ultimately to start removing the tremendous excess of anthropogenic CO2 we already have in our atmosphere so we can restore our climate to a safer and healthier state. If you're new to CDR, we'll put some resources in the chat. For a great place to start is the CDR primer. Also this series, as I mentioned, we've now had 41 episodes exploring different ways to remove different ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So plenty of great videos on the Open Air YouTube channel, and we'll put a few other links in the chat. I want to hand it over to my colleague, Irene, who will introduce herself and then introduce today's session.
Hi, everyone. My name is Irene Polnyi, and I serve as the Executive Director for the Oceans 2050 Institute for Abundant Oceans, where we apply best-in-class science to ocean restoration projects. I'm also an Open Air volunteer. Some housekeeping notes to get started. Our format will be a short presentation from John and Dr. Marr, followed by a few prepared questions, then moderated audience Q&A. So please type any questions you get as you're listening into the Zoom's Q&A box, not the chat. This will help us stay organized. This event is also being recorded, and we'll send the video link to everyone who registered and also post it to Open Air's website and YouTube channel. Now for the main event. This week on This Is CDR, we're pleased to welcome Seafields, co-founder director John Auckland and Chief Science Officer Dr. Fernández-Méndez to tell us how the company removes CO2 from the atmosphere and durably sequesters it in the deep ocean via open sea cultivation of sargassum. John Auckland is an experienced entrepreneur and public speaker who sold his first company before age 30. He founded the global crowdfunding agency TribeFirst, as well as the GreenTribe Fund, a seed stage ESG fund. John has helped 90+ companies raise over £50 million and has served as Virgin Startup's crowdfunding trainer and a Virgin Startup ambassador. Dr. Fernández-Méndez holds a Master's of Science in Marine Microbiology from the Max Planck Institute for Marine Microbiology and a PhD in Biological Oceanography from the Alfred Wegener Institute, where she leads a Helmholtz Young Investigator Group. Mar has participated in 10 seagoing research expeditions from the Arctic to the tropics and published over 20 peer-reviewed articles in scientific journals. She co-hosts the Sargassum Podcast and is a member of the Ocean Artificial Upwelling project. John and Dr. Marr, please take it away.
Thanks very much for the introduction. I'll start by telling the background story to Seafields, then I'll hand over to Marr, who, as our scientist, is far more suited to tell the story of how we exactly remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and the oceans. So our founding story started with one of our co-founders, a chap called Sebastian Stevens, who is a long-time internet entrepreneur, who amongst many other things, helped set up the Southern Caribbean Fiber Network, spends a lot of time in the Caribbean doing business, spends a lot of time sailing through Sargassum. And he contacted me one day to talk about a crowdfunding campaign because he wanted to crowdfund the airline that he normally uses in the Caribbean to island hop so he can do business. And he contacted me to say that there was potentially an opportunity to acquire it, and could we crowdfund it? And I said, not really, because unfortunately air travel is seen as a negative thing with young retail investors. You need the support of young retail investors for a successful crowdfunding campaign. Find a way to run it on biodiesel or biofuel, or an electric fleet, and we've probably got a campaign. So about a week later, he sent me a podcast. And in this podcast, the Sargassum Podcast, of which Ma is the host, and Ma and another colleague of ours, Fran, were interviewing Dr. Victor Smetacek. And Victor is if you've never read any of Victor's work, I implore you to look him up and watch this very episode of the podcast. I think it was episode 4, was it, Ma? I believe. So definitely watch that podcast back. And in this podcast, Victor's talking about this possibility of a new agricultural revolution in the ocean, and this amazing brown seaweed Sargassum that is pelagic. It's grows by fragmentation. It has a very high carbon to nutrient ratio, and it makes it a very good carbon dioxide remover. Because if you can grow this in the vastness of the subtropical gyres, bale it up, drink it, sink it to the bottom of the ocean, there it shall remain for a minimum of 700 years. And I was watching this, and it's just the penny dropped for me. In my years at TribeFirst, running a crowdfunding agency, supporting hundreds of environmental startups, all making these tiny incremental gains towards solving the climate crisis. And all of a sudden, there's something coming along that's talking about percentage point gains, and it absolutely blew my mind. And we realised there and then that we needed to start a company. We gathered Victor, Fran, Ma, and a few others together, and so Seafields was born. Do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I'll take it from there. I will share my screen with some slides, and I will try not to repeat the wonders of Sargassum. No, I will repeat them because it's really amazing. So I guess most of you in this chat today, you know all about ocean-based solutions, but just as a reminder, there are several options that we can use the ocean to sequester carbon. And till now, artificial upwelling, which I've been involved in several projects about it with Dr. Ulf Riebesel at Geomar during my latest postdoc, and also marine biomass, so growing mangroves or seagrasses, etc., have been both proposed as ways of sequestering CO2 in the ocean through biomass creation. And with time, I kind of realized that if we want to sequester it for the long term, and we want to be able to monitor it, phytoplankton is actually a very complicated way to do it. You can do it, it could work, but it's just these tiny organisms that I've been working with my entire life, but they're just more complicated to track down. So when I heard about this floating seaweed, I was like, okay, this might be a better way to go. So this is a depiction of all the blue carbon options, and they all have different potentials on the amount of carbon they can sequester. All the coastal options, they're great, but the coasts are limited. So everything that goes towards using the open ocean, which is vast areas, is of course much more promising for the upscaling to the gigaton scale. And so we are thinking of using the subtropical gyre. So these areas here in blue, basically where right now there's very, very low productivity. And the reason why there's very low productivity is because the nutrients are in the deeper layers of the ocean, and because of the heat and the stratification, they don't manage to get to the surface. And that's why almost nothing is growing there. So we call them the ocean deserts and the subtropical gyres. And if you see here from the currents, they're also kind of enclosed lenses of water, and that's also why in those areas is where we find now this big island plastic patches basically accumulating in those areas, and nothing escapes those areas. So we were thinking of employing artificial upwelling in those areas to bring nutrient-rich deep waters to the sunlit surface to enhance productivity at the surface. Now, most of the approaches that have been proposed till now, they bring the water through a mechanical way. And so the water, when it reaches the surface, it's basically cold, so it sinks again. So this could be good for phytoplankton and fish, but it's not good for the purpose of growing floating macroalgae, which is what we want to do. So we are in love with this macroalgae called Sargassum, and in particular 2 species of Sargassum, Sargassum fluitans and Sargassum natans, because they grow floating at the surface of the ocean. They grow really fast, as John already said. They grow by fragmentation, so there's no complicated hatching and all these stages that you need to do with kelp, for example. Kelp is a much more complicated algae because it has a sexual reproductive cycle. Sargassum just reproduces by fragmentation. It has very high productivity rates. It is free floating. It doesn't require a substrate to grow. And so for us, this was like, okay, this is the winner for our purpose. And so that's how Seafields was created, with the aim of basically developing sustainable open ocean aqua farming of Sargassum. And of course, for that, we also need to develop the monitoring and tracking tools necessary to do that. We're using a combination of drones and satellites to do this. We need to make sure that when we harvest the Sargassum, it's a bycatch-free harvesting. So we're testing different ways of harvesting the Sargassum to do this. We also collaborate with other companies to create high-value products from the Sargassum so that we have kind of 2 revenue streams. And then we're, of course, also looking at how to bail and sink the Sargassum safely and permanently in the deep sea. And I will talk a bit more about this soon. But just a bit of background of where Sargassum is at the moment. Sargassum is historically in the Sargasso Sea. And in 2011, due to climate change, actually, so it's also a human-made thing, Sargassum escaped the Sargasso Sea because of extreme North Atlantic oscillation. And it basically came down here to the tropical Atlantic and established a new population there that we now call the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt. And this population grows now every year. And because of the wind and the currents, most of it ends in the Caribbean, causing great problems there. So right now I'm in Mexico, and I can see every day on the beaches tons and tons of Sargassum arriving, rotting on the coast. And so Sargassum can be a great habitat, but it's not a main food source. So when there are several studies looking at the gut content of the diverse fauna living within the Sargasso, for example, in the Sargasso Sea, and they use it more like a protection area. So there's baby fish, there's turtles, there's little amphipods, crabs, everything growing in there, but they don't really feed on the Sargassum. I mean, you do find between 0 and 40% of carbon content from Sargassum in the stomachs of some animals, but this is not their main food source. That's also why it accumulates, right, in such large areas. And so the Sargassum carbon cycle right now looks roughly like this, especially in the Caribbean. When Sargassum reaches the coast, it starts decomposing and emitting CO2. So only if you collect that Sargassum before it rots and you use it for something like creating products from it, where you can lock the carbon in those products, then you're avoiding emissions. But if you really want to use Sargassum for active carbon sequestration, so CDR, which is what we're talking about today, you need to do additionality, meaning it's not enough with collecting the Sargassum that is already there and sequestering that just avoids emissions in the best case, but you need to grow more Sargassum. That's why we're thinking of open ocean aqua farms. And then you need to actively sink that Sargassum to really deep depths, like 4,000 meters, in areas where you don't damage any biodiversity in the deep sea, to be able to actually enhance the sequestration potential of Sargassum. And so the vision is, right now we're doing lots of tests in the Caribbean to test all the parts of the aqua farms, but the vision is to create several aqua farms in an area that would cover roughly 60,000 square kilometers in the middle of the subtropical Atlantic, where we would sequester 1 gigaton of CO2 per year. And for that, we need to grow a lot of tons of Sargassum and process them and sink them. Now, there's also one project that we just started right now together with our partners Carbon Wave and the Alfred Wegener Institute, where I work, and Geomar, where we want to design and validate the model of the Sargassum open ocean aqua farm. So that's mostly Seafields' task. But then we want to develop a fermentation pathway from Sargassum to create ethanol. And ethanol is basically the precursor for plastics. So we want to be able one day to create all our farming infrastructures and the pipes and everything with the plastics we create from Sargassum to create basically a circular economy. So now we're doing the first steps towards that. And then these are some images of our first trial. So we want to have free-floating aqua farming structures or barriers. And this is one image from our trials a few months ago in St. Vincent. And we're still refining and working on how to make these barriers that they open themselves with the wind and the current. So it's not an easy task, but we're learning a lot as we're doing. And the one thing that was really great of this test is that these barriers contain really well the sargassum in them. Then, as I said, we're also testing new tools to monitor the sargassum. So right now in Mexico, for example, we have a multispectral drone with us, and we're trying to map the patches of sargassum, and not only look at the quantity of sargassum that is there, both by combining the aerial measurements and the in-water measurements, as you see here, because it can be very variable, the depth and the density of the sargassum, but also to look at the NDVI values with a multispectral camera, which can tell us what's the health status of the sargassum. And then a little bit about the stomal pipe. So this is right now in the modeling phase. So we managed to create together with Geomar a model that basically shows that we get this upwelling rates. And the great thing of our type of pipe, it's based on the stomal principle. It's a stomal pipe, and it's basically a double pipe. So we have internally several pipes and outside one bigger pipe, and we have both upwelling and downwelling. And what happens then is that there's a heat exchange while this happens. And so the water that arrives at the surface is actually warm, and it stays at the surface, feeding basically with nutrients our sargassum. And then we have also downwelling of the nutrient poor waters that are deeper, and they go down and they also oxygenate the deeper layers. So we avoid oxygen depleted areas below the farms. Now about sinking the bales, maybe I can show this little video if it works. These are the first tests we did. So we process the sargassum in a certain way so that we remove all the bubbles. And then at this stage, we were wrapping them with a normal net, but we were planning to use biodegradable nets basically. And then basically you don't need to do anything. It just sinks. You just drop it and it sinks down into the ocean. So that's the first test we did about that. And then, of course, we are starting this year, end of this year, the first long-term monitoring scheme of the deep sea with some bales that we will put there to actually see what happens with the biodiversity there, what is the remineralization rate, because our expectations based on the literature is that if we compact and bale the biomass, and especially I forgot to mention, we remove the nutrients of the biomass before we sink it, so we only sink the carbon-rich part of the sargassum, then we expect very, very slow remineralization rates. It's basically like even worse than wood, like almost nothing will be able to chew on it and eat it. So that's our expectation, but we of course want to prove it, and so we will set up a whole monitoring scheme in the deep sea to do this. And just to finish, we of course are aware of all the steps we need to go through before we get carbon credits, and we're already working with verification agencies to get the protocol established. And so we are now here at the beginning, right? We're doing the feasibility study of the approach to look at all the areas, including a life cycle assessment to take into account all the CO2 emissions that we might make during the processing. And then at the end of that process, we will get our carbon credits and we'll be ready to sell those. And I think with that, I will stop the presentation and we can open the question part.
That's great. Thank you so much. Very exciting. We're going to start with a few prepared questions, and then everyone in the audience, please feel free to put your questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll be getting to those in a few minutes. Between the two of you kind of covered the Seafields origin story, which is kind of where we often start our Q&A, but could each of you maybe talk a little bit about how you personally started to become interested in climate, and then specifically CDR, and then maybe specifically blue carbon and ocean CDR? John, if you or Mar, whoever wants to go first.
Mar, you can go first.
Okay, I'll go first. So for me, it's actually a very dramatic story. Yeah, so I did my PhD in the Arctic Ocean, and I used to go every year to the Arctic Ocean to study phytoplankton's primary productivity there. And basically every year you went to the Arctic, you see how this ecosystem was decaying and degrading, and every year it was changed and worse. And so at some point I thought, okay, I cannot really continue doing this and just being the observer of the catastrophe and writing, IPCC reports, so to say, warning the society and the politicians about this. So I thought I have to do something about it. And that's why I started getting into the Ocean CDR community and seeing, okay, how can we turn the ocean from being a victim to being part of the solution?
Yes, so from my part, I've always been interested in environmental impact, not limited purely to CDR, but from anything from using entrepreneurialism and ingenuity of startups and the startups being much more sort of fluid and dynamic, and using sort of these skill sets of entrepreneurs to solve big problems. And as I said, my time at TribeFirst, I saw thousands of pitch decks. We ran Collective Impact and CrowdBoost, which are two different accelerator programs that we run with the Branson family and Virgin Startup. And so screened hundreds of environmental impact startups that were applying to go on these programs. And they're all making these tiny little, very important, but very, very small contributions towards solving the climate crisis. Or solving the plastic crisis, whatever it might be. So I've had an interest in this for some time, and as I said, I've never felt the need to move from the fundraising side to the founding side, because nothing's caught my attention to this scale. And so when we watched that podcast, and bearing in mind we were looking for a solution to, again, another relatively small part of the problem, the sustainable aviation fuel, which as it happens, ironically, Sargassum may even be potentially useful for, right? Because again, to create a sustainable aviation fuel, you need volume. And so where they use things like sugarcane at the moment, it's impractical because you're competing for space on land. So actually, again, another amazing use of Sargassum could be going right back to the start of the story. But we pivoted into the carbon sink solution just because, if I'm being honest, I'd lost a lot of hope with us being able to fix the climate crisis. I didn't have enough hope in humanity to be able to decarbonize. I still don't, if I'm being honest. The scale of decarbonisation that we need to go through is so great, and the lack of urgency that we're currently seeing, and a lot of people that I've spoken to, certainly younger millennials, Gen Z, that are going to have to deal with this problem the most, they have lacked a lot of hope. And I genuinely wondered whether I wanted to bring children into this world, right? Because it's so severe. And seeing Victor's and Mars podcast, that's what it gave me. It gave me hope. And so I knew I needed to do something about it.
That's great. Well, thank you both for that. Number two, can, obviously measurement, reporting, and verification is critical to any carbon removal method. And, there's quite a bit of uncertainty out there about MRV for CDR via ocean-based methods. Could you walk through just the steps by which your process removes CO2 from the atmosphere? So you're, just kind of out, soup to nuts, like how is CO2 actually being removed from the atmosphere by your process?
Yeah, so basically our process is very easy in the sense that nature does it for us. It's basically Sargassum, while it grows, it does photosynthesis like any other algae or any other plant, and it sequesters CO2 from the surface water, and that water basically gets replenished with the CO2 from the atmosphere. And because Sargassum creates a very thin stratified layer at the surface, this happens relatively fast. And then basically the carbon is stored in the biomass of the Sargassum. There's also another pool of carbon that is the dissolved organic carbon that the Sargassum excretes. And from that dissolved organic carbon pool, there's a part that doesn't get remineralized by bacteria. It's called the recalcitrant dissolved organic carbon. So that's also another pool of carbon sequestration coming from the Sargassum. But basically the rest of the carbon is in the biomass, in the particulate organic carbon fraction. And usually in nature, what happens is that a part of that will be eaten, a part of that will sink, and that part that sinks basically is storing carbon for the long term. Now, how long that carbon gets stored depends on where that carbon ends up and what happens to it at the bottom. So if Sargassum sinks naturally, Probably bacteria will remineralize parts of it, will eat it, and only a small percentage will end up being sequestered for the long term in the sediments in the bottom. However, if we process the sargassum, we remove the nutrients, which, remember, the bacteria, to do remineralization, they also need nutrients. So if we remove the nutrients, or at least most of it, and it's a very, like carbon-rich kind of material, then that carbon will very probably not be remineralized. And if at all, it will be remineralized very, very slowly. And I mean, we have the example, the oil that we are now extracting from below the surface deep sea, it's basically from algae and plants that died a million years ago and were kept there for millions of years. So it's basically trying to reverse that process again and making depots of high energy, high carbon biomass in the deep sea again.
Yeah, and to answer the part of the question about MRB, we have an advantage over a lot of the other ocean CDR techniques because we create bales that you can actually see. You know, you saw that video, right? You see an actual bale drop into the bottom of the ocean, and we can send ROVs down there that can go and look and see that bale is still intact. And you know, that's quite uncommon in most ocean CDR sort of techniques. And that gives us two things. One, it gives us the social license because people can visualize it. And if they want to, they can go and see it. But it also makes that whole sort of measurement piece a lot easier. But ultimately, even the ones that are harder to measure, you know, we've got to do the hard work to try and find ways of measuring it. And we've got to have some degree of acceptance and sort of tolerance around, you know, the fact that we're going to have some kind of buffers in place, whatever it might be, to account for it. You know, we need to do one of the largest engineering projects in human history in moving carbon from the, you know, atmosphere, the high carbon cycle, and moving into the low carbon cycle. And the ocean is the best solution for that. So we actually work quite closely with a lot of other ocean CDR companies, you know, support them, consult with them on a regular basis. You know, we were on the World Ocean Council panel session at the UN Ocean Conference last week. And you know, there's a lot of discussion in the UN Ocean Conference around how to create these frameworks for blue carbon accounting. So, you know, whilst our job is slightly easier, we are going to support the people that are kind of finding it a bit harder to do, if that makes sense.
A couple quick questions of clarification with respect to the method. So you're cultivating sargassum in the open ocean. You're using the upwelling to bring nutrients from the deep ocean to the ocean surface, which is nutrient poor, right? And then the sargassum is not drawing the CO2 down directly from the atmosphere. It's taking organic carbon that's dissolved, or inorganic carbon dissolved in the ocean, and ingesting that for its photosynthetic process, right? So that's okay. That's one thing I used to not understand. So I think it's kind of a helpful clarification. And we're going to get to the compensatory drawdown of the ocean to compensate for the inorganic carbon intake from the sargassum in a second. But in terms of calculating the ton, so you can weigh your bales, and there's a pretty clear, you can basically determine what is like the carbon, you know, if you have a ton of bale, how much carbon is in there?
It's 30%.
30%? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And then, so the next question is going to relate to the last question, but I know you're very aware, but there's been a lot of discussion in the climate sort of CDR community about both MRB and the life cycle analysis of ocean-based CDR methods, and specifically the net negativity of marine cultivation of microalgae. I'm just going to throw a couple of assertions out there, and each one probably could be its own episode, so we don't have time to go in depth, but it would be great to get kind of your top line reaction to how it relates to your process and maybe how you're thinking about it. Are you doing research to answer the question? Do you think it's not an issue? So number one is, if you're cultivating macroalgae in the ocean, is there resource competition with phytoplankton? Because phytoplankton have their own, you know, already existing drawdown process of carbon dioxide. Can you just talk briefly about that?
Yes, so first of all, we've thought about this a lot because there are a few papers that came out saying that might be an issue. There are other papers, modeling papers mostly, saying that this is not an issue at the regional scale. But in our case, because we're doing this in the open ocean, in the subtropical gyres that are currently ocean deserts, so there's no big phytoplankton blooms growing there. So if at all, we will actually create also phytoplankton blooms. So we will have both actually phytoplankton and macroalgae growing. So it's basically turning a desert into an oasis. So in our case, there's no competition with phytoplankton because there was no phytoplankton there. It's not the same as if you grow kelp, for example, in an upwelling region, because there you have those nutrients that regularly come to the surface, and then either they go in one pool or the other, or they basically distribute between both. But in our case, we're basically creating a new ecosystem. And we have the question, of course, on a global scale, what does it mean if we bring those nutrients from those deeper waters to the surface, right? And this is something that we're answering with Earth system models right now. And the problem is that the Earth system models at the moment, they don't represent sargassum correctly, because they're all based on our knowledge on phytoplankton and benthic macroalgae, but not pelagic macroalgae. So we're now trying to take all the measurements necessary to parametricize those models to actually include sargassum and be able to see on the global scale what would be the effect of upwelling lots of water from the deeper ocean to the surface. However, just looking at the numbers, the pool of medium Antarctic water down there with nutrients is so vast that it's not really going to make a big impact.
That's great. Thank you so much. So number two, and just to understand, these questions are kind of coming from a place of, these questions probably, you need to answer them and we want to understand them. We're definitely not trying to be gotcha in any way. So number two, one of the other things that we've read is that if you're cultivating macroalgae in the ocean, the biomass can decompose before you get a chance to sequester it. So if you're cultivating additional biomass, you could be actually releasing additional CO2 from that decomposition. Is that something that is a concern, or am I misunderstanding, or?
So to be honest, like what I've seen in my observations on sargassum patches in the Caribbean is that if basically everything that is still at the surface is thriving and is alive, because if it dies, and I have just some mesocosms running right now with sargassum, if the sargassum dies, it sinks. So it basically sequesters the carbon on its own before it, it doesn't rot at the surface and emits the CO2 back. It just goes down.
Okay. Yeah, it's only when it beaches, and when it beaches, it releases methane as well, which is far from ideal. So we are also looking at as kind of an extension of our activities to avoid, support avoided beaching as well, and which will support the local communities in the Caribbean as well.
And having been to that coast, I definitely understand that's an issue. Okay, so another one, and this is one that's pretty common to maybe not every, but many ocean-based CDR methods. It doesn't seem like the rate of oceanic drawdown of atmospheric CO2 relative to the removal of dissolved inorganic carbon from the ocean, or addition. Also, this is not relevant to you, but adding alkalinity to the ocean is 1-to-1. Based on, what is your thought on that? Like, so if your macroalgae is removing a ton of dissolved inorganic carbon from the ocean, and you're sequestering that, and assuming that all goes perfectly well, like what is your model showing that the ocean is taking from the atmosphere? Is it also a ton, or is it less, or what is the rate for that in your view?
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on the temperature and the exchange rate from the atmosphere to the surface ocean. So that will depend on where exactly you do that. So we're right now doing measurements to actually get those calculations right. And we're using PCO2 sensors to measure the air flux exchange. So it actually happens really fast. I mean, we just went yesterday with a PCO2 sensor, and it's amazing. You cross through sargassum patches and you see a drop in the PCO2 because it's consuming the CO2, and then you move out and then you have a normal, exchange with the atmosphere. So you see that drawdown, and we have to measure that, right? We have to see how quickly it equilibrates with the atmosphere, but it's really fast, and why not? It's 1-to-1. Why wouldn't it be 1-to-1 in that case?
I'm not qualified to answer that question, but there's been I've seen quite a bit of a number of assertions that it's as low as 0.4 or potentially even lower, and that it happens over months and years and not weeks and months.
But that's depending where you are in the ocean. And if that's mostly assuming this really deep mixed layer depth of like 50 meters. And then yes, it can take forever. That's also the problem of phytoplankton. But in this case, as I said, sargassum is usually between 10 and 80 centimeters, and it creates kind of its own stratified layer at the surface. So that would be way faster. It would be days, even hours.
So your thesis is very quickly and 1-to-1. That's the Seafields thesis. Okay.
Yeah. But we will measure it.
Okay. Final question on this issue. And again, maybe I have my facts confused, but my understanding is that there's a concern out there that artificial upwelling brings dissolved inorganic carbon from the deep ocean to the surface, and there's a risk that some of that could be released into the atmosphere via that process. Is that an issue? Can you comment on how you see that?
Yeah, so it is correct that artificial upwelling brings also dissolved inorganic carbon, because obviously if you have more nutrients down there, it's because remineralization has taken place, making those nutrients available, and therefore you also have extra DIC. However, the trick is always, what is the carbon to nutrient ratio of your uptake rates of your biomass? And so that's why Sargassum is the best to do this versus other algae, because it has this really high carbon to nutrient ratio between 28 and 50. So if we manage to grow the Sargassum and keep those high C2N ratios while it grows, then we won't have that problem, because what you bring up is on Redfield, and what you absorb is higher than Redfield. So you're absorbing more carbon per unit of nutrient upwelled.
So you initially can calibrate the upwelling rate or quantity to the uptake by the Sargassum, so that you're not
exactly
the excess. Okay, great.
Exactly.
One last question. It's a little bit of a different question. And there was a recent article in the MIT Tech Review that maybe Chris can put in the chat, that on running tide, that I personally think was a little bit unfair. But one of the issues was potential harms of from scale cultivation of macroalgae. They talked about a lot of the things we just talked about, but one that we didn't talk about was disturbance to ecosystems by, via the deep ocean sequestration of biomass. You did address this in your presentation, but I do think it's important, because these are open systems that are critical to humanity. So how do you think about assessing those potential risks, and what do you think they are, and what's your plan on that, a little more specifically than what you told me?
So there's two levels of ecosystem impacts. One is, of course, at the pelagic level. So just by growing this macroalgae on the surface, you can have impacts. And the other one is on the deep sea. And I want to make the point that there's a big difference between releasing a benthic species into the open ocean and having a species that is already pelagic and is already growing through the entire tropical Atlantic and in the Sargasso Sea, and just basically expanding that ecosystem. So
could you define benthic and pelagic for people really quick?
Yeah, okay, sorry. So benthic are the ones that require a substrate, and they grow attached to either the seafloor or rocks or whatever. So that's kelp. Most of the macroalgae are actually benthic. However, Sargassum, as I said, these two species of Sargassum, because there are other species of Sargassum that are benthic, but these two species that we're talking about, Sargassum fluitans and Sargassum natans, they grow their entire life free floating. They do not require any type of substrate, and they already grow now in nature in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of the Atlantic. So we're not bringing an invasive species into an ecosystem that was not used to it before. We're bringing it to a new place, but it's basically in the same area, like it's the same Atlantic. It's not bringing coastal species, benthic species to the open ocean. So that's different.
Got it.
So for example, in the middle of the Atlantic, you already find 4 times more Sargassum than on the surface under the Sargasso Sea. So this is a natural process. So we're not bringing an algae to the deep sea that has not been there before. So there will be some species down there that are already used to it, and maybe they chew on it, although the few papers that are out there trying to do experiments with Sargassum, they basically say, yeah, there was one amphipod that took a piece and ran away. So that's, it doesn't seem to be eaten. Like if you put a mackerel or whatever, a fish down there, it's eaten in seconds, but Sargassum doesn't seem to be their preferred food source. And so we're not expecting high impacts in terms of biodiversity, etc. And to be honest, if at all, we will probably increase biodiversity, because we're planning to do this in the areas of the deep ocean where it's basically the abyssal plain full of clay, like also the ocean deserts kind of. So if you put these bales down there, they will probably create structures like artificial reefs, like when a boat sinks, right? And then you see all this biodiversity growing on them. So if at all, I think we're going to see an increase in biodiversity. Right. But we will, of course, do experiments to prove this. So that's a crucial part of our approach. And we start these experiments in September.
And just one, like so the material's already down there. Is there a way to represent experimentally, like just the immense increase in volume that your process would create if you are doing a gigaton scale? Like there's no way to really model that, right? I mean, there's no way to really test that via an experiment.
No, I mean, you can, of course, I mean, yes, you can use a Earth system model. Once you have measured, you know, at a decent size scale experiment, you've measured, for example, the oxygen consumption rates, the DIC, like all the parameters that you can measure at the deep sea, in the bales, around the bales. Then you can, of course, use a model to upscale that to different areas before you actually do it in reality. Yeah.
Thank you so much for answering all those questions. We're going to flip to audience questions in just a second. I'd love to talk very briefly. One of our favorite organizations out there is Ocean Visions, and you guys are part of Ocean Visions' Launchpad program. Could one of you just kind of quickly tell the audience about that program and you know how it's been for you being part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were selected as one of 6 companies to participate in the Ocean Visions Launchpad program, which is supporting 6 CDR companies to attempt to win the Elon Musk carbon removal X Prize. And it's been fantastic for us. Anything from participating in a Creative Destruction Labs session where we were kind of set up with different mentors. We've also got 4 or 5 mentors that we've been assigned that are supporting specific problems. We got anything from you know, the legal sort of structures that we need to consider while setting up our hyperscale farm, to solving some of the modeling problems, to potential sort of engineering solutions around the materials that we use. So really sort of specific problems that we've got to solve that we don't have in-house capacity or capability for, they've set us up with. And also just being able to get us out there into the world, into events. You know, there's they supported us in getting on the World Ocean Council panel session. We're going to be doing the Sustainable Ocean Summit in October in Barcelona, and what's the other one? COP27 potentially. Some sort of project there, and also potentially South by Southwest. So just being able to get us these platforms where we can tell the world what we're doing and gain that social license has been hugely important to us.
Fantastic. Cool. Well, Irene, do you want to come on? And we have a bunch of audience questions and would love to kind of get through some of those. And thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Toby, for kicking us off with such great questions. The Q&A chat is just going nuts with questions. So I think a lot of people are very interested in your approach. I know, Mara, you mentioned, you spoke about this a little bit, but we do have a lot of questions about the impact on biodiversity. I know you mentioned that remains to be seen, but I don't want to leave these folks hanging. So maybe you can speak a little bit about, you know, some anticipated impacts that you guys foresee and how specifically you guys are thinking about looking for that, and what kind of metrics will you guys be measuring for? Maybe you can speak to the process a little bit.
Yeah, so one thing that also came through Ocean Visions is that I'm part of a sinking seaweed working group that Ocean Visions organized. And so there were a group of, like, I think it's 40 international scientists, and we're trying to agree on which kind of experiments we need to set up to actually assess the environmental impacts of sinking seaweed at scale. And so as part of that, I learned a lot. And now as a chief scientist of Seafields, I'm trying to, you know, transfer that knowledge to what we are doing, and we're trying to set up the first big experiment in the Atlantic by sinking 30 bales and then monitoring different things for a year. Like, for example, we will have cameras down there looking at which type of macrofauna approaches the bales and what they do with them. And then after a year, we will also measure oxygen concentrations in the bales, next to the bales, and far away from the bales, to have a control site to see if we see any oxygen consumption from remineralization. We will also have different types of bales, meaning bales that are maybe processed, bales that are not processed, was just the raw sargassum compressed without doing anything to it. And so we can see also if different ways of treating the sargassum before sinking it is beneficial for the longer storage of the carbon down there. So those are the main two parameters that we're going to look at: oxygen consumption and biodiversity visual estimates. We're also looking into doing microbiology, so taking samples of the sediment and the bales to see which bacteria grow in there and how much they consume. And then we will also look at stable isotopes to see the trophic transfer, to see if we find in the guts of the sea cucumbers or whatever is down there, if we see traces of the sargassum there. But again, we don't expect to see a lot of carbon transfer to the biomass down there, because imagine it's like when you're in the field and you see these hay balls, they're completely compacted. Like a cow wouldn't go there and try to eat that, right? They would eat other things around. So that's the expectation, but we of course will measure that. Yeah.
Can I also just sort of say from a more philosophical perspective, I guess, it's quite hard. It's hard to imagine the oceans because they're these kind of exotic and far away systems. And so we assume that they are these pristine systems that are, that the environment's completely untouched by human hands, and it's just not true. They're pretty damaged. And so we live in the Anthropocene. We kind of human activity is experienced everywhere on the planet, and very acutely in the oceans through acidification. So this process, by not only supporting deacidification of the oceans, but also enhancing biodiversity, it's just logic that the net effects are going to be positive versus negative. So yes, we have to do the right things in terms of making sure that we don't create some catastrophe or some disaster, but really the threshold has to be quite hard for there being an argument against us doing this, incredibly high. And so the danger is that we are inactive in trying to fix the problem that we've created as humanity. And so of course we're going to get our critics, but at the same time, we've got to be pretty thick-skinned and pursue this anyway. And as I say, only some kind of grand catastrophe really would be enough to make this a solid argument against what we're doing.
And I think to both of your points, it would have to be quite a big impact for it to be worth it, all this effort, right? So that's a good, I think, segue into another question that I think you've answered a couple of different ways from Toby, but we're getting some questions about those blocks. If you guys could give an estimate of the tonnage that's being sequestered per each of those blocks. So I think folks like the visual and being able to kind of connect that to a number in their minds.
I mean, that will depend in the end of the type of machinery that we develop and put on the boats to do this. So the size of the base right now for the test is very small, but hopefully when we upscale, it will be more like the bigger scale. So that will depend, we don't know yet. I cannot tell you a number per bale because the bale size will change. But once we have a defined machinery that we know, okay, this type of bale is the one that works after doing the environmental impact assessment, this is the best way so that it remineralizes less. This is the way we're going to wrap it with biodegradable net or whatever. Then we can say, okay, per unit, we have this amount of carbon. But that's a very easy calculation. I mean, because measuring carbon that's my job, basically. So that would not be a problem.
Okay. And John, you alluded to this earlier about kind of interrupting the sargassum before it reaches the shore. Are methane emissions avoidance part of your calculus in terms of impact?
So we're exploring two tracks. We're exploring whether it's possible to get verified credits for avoided beaching, as well as for sinking the solid bales. So we know that methane is emitted when they break down, and also arsenic, which is far from ideal for the local sort of population of the Caribbean where this does beach. And the models are very different, because if you're near shore, it makes a lot more sense to turn. Sargassum is, a lot of people say to us, "Well, you're crazy. Why are you sinking it? It's valuable. It's got loads of really useful stuff in it." So near shore, because you have the supply chains to actually, and we work with Carbon Wave on this, to turn it into products, anything from vegan leather to bioethanol, such as we're working on. It makes far more sense to actually use it for these, even concrete, right? It's been turned into sargassum-based concrete. And in a sense, that is a form of sequestration or emissions avoidance, because ultimately you're replacing fossil fuels. You know, a great example is the cosmetics industry at the moment cannot create an emulsifier without using fossil fuels. And Carbon Wave have produced a emulsifier born out of Sargassum, and the cosmetics industry is incredibly excited about that. So it doesn't make sense to necessarily sink it, but ultimately by turning it into products, you're avoiding the methane anyway. But pretty much the only revenue source for the open ocean aqua farming will be sinking the bales. We can squeeze some stuff out of it. So we squeeze sulfates, nitrates, alginates, maybe be able to extract some of the cellulose and various other things before we process it and bale it and sink it. But it's probably more beneficial for us to use kind of where we are. So potentially as our own biofertilizer, a biostimulant for growing our sargassum, rather than shipping it back to land, because that then eats into your additionality.
That's a really nice segue into another question that some of the audience members have asked about the process for removing those nutrients and whether there is a use for them. And it sounds like you're using that as an internal part of your process. Maybe you can speak to how you're going to extract those nutrients. Yeah, so basically what we realized when we were preparing the first bales is that by basically squeezing the sargassum and removing the bubbles, you already extract a good percentage of the nutrients in there. So they go out in the liquid phase, basically. So that we already did some tests using that biostimulant to refertilize the sargassum and see how it grows. And that works very nicely. And now we're trying to develop through this Sprint D project a new method based on leach bed technology to basically get out even more nutrients and get to higher percentage of nutrient recovery. So these experiments are happening this summer. Wonderful, thank you. One more question on kind of the process and the farm structure. One reader or audience member asks, it sounds like you're proposing a large man-made structure in the open ocean. Do any such structures currently exist? And can you talk about the failure modes? What happens if ships interact with the structure, or if there's a risk of someone trying to damage it or otherwise steal the equipment? Yeah,
so you can go for it.
So yeah, I mean, the area of the ocean that we're building this is it's one of the, I mean, it's near St. Helena, right, which is where Napoleon was exiled. It's one of the most remote places on the planet, and that gives us a few benefits. We're away from any sort of major shipping routes. We're obviously going to track whether kind of whale migratory routes are a big thing, because we're talking about pipes that are 350 meters down in the ocean. And so, the bigger concern really is sort of other sort of marine life getting entangled in our nets and our pipes. And there are solutions for that, sort of things that keep the life away. But yeah, and it's a long way to go if you wanted to go and try and vandalize. You've got to do quite an expedition to get out to of Republic of Sargassum to get out and vandalize this. You'd have to have a pretty well-funded vandalizing mission. So we're not too worried about that. But yeah, I mean, these are logistics problems that we got to think about, right?
Yeah, but also think that our nets are, I mean, we will make them as low cost as possible, because we need huge areas that are fenced, so to say, to keep the sargassum in. We will have a monitoring system constantly going out to monitor the farm. So if something gets broken or whatever, we can fix it. Also, the aqua drones that will be harvesting the sargassum will be constantly harvesting. So there will always be some sort of monitoring of the farms happening. And also regarding entanglement of marine life, with the experiments we did in St. Vincent last month, we saw a lot of marine life close to us. We saw turtles, we saw sharks, we saw a lot of fish. And in 1 month of trials, we never saw one single entanglement of any animal on our net. So that's already a positive sign that our nets, because they're not very deep, they're 1.5 meters deep, any marine life can basically swim around them, and they're not closed. So it's just a barrier. It's not really a net.
Got it. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you saw the small fish is kind of swimming, trying to hide from the predators. in amongst the nets. It's quite cool.
Okay, shifting gears a little bit into policy. Someone is asking, deploying deep ocean solutions would seem to present very complicated issues related to governance beyond national jurisdictions. Can you speak to the role of the UN, the EU, and individual countries in oversight, permitting, paying for CDR, et cetera? And where should climate advocates be focusing our energies within these policies?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I can't remember the name of the group that was set up, and it was announced at this latest UN Ocean Conference, which is essentially looking at these very issues, how the ocean can be used as a CDR tool, and making sure that it's kind of protected in the process, but also leveraged for its potential. Maybe I can dig it out and share it on Twitter or something later. But there was a bunch of different groups that were being created that are looking at these issues, anywhere from how you can sort of verify carbon credits through to how you can just sort of protect the oceans whilst encouraging its potential. Where we sit, because we are an open ocean aquafarm, we can pretty much do this wherever we want, as long as it's outside of any country's EEZ. Another sort of reason why we've chosen the Ascension Islands is we're a UK-based company. The Ascension Islands are UK overseas territories. So whilst they're typically around Ascension Island itself and St. Helena, they're marine protected zones across the entire EEZ. So we're relatively restricted in what we can do within the EEZ itself, but it gives us infrastructure close to where we kind of need it, and potentially support to get licensed, at least to have the port and a land mass that we can kind of take stuff back to and start expeditions out from and all that kind of stuff. There are a couple of protocols we need to be concerned about. So things like the London Protocol, for example, dictates what we can do with waste. Now, whether you deem a belled sargassum or sargassum bell, should I say, to be waste, because we monetize it, potentially it might be interpretation of the London Protocol that we kind of go against it, but it's not what the London Protocol was set up for. So in terms of advocacy, yeah, I mean, getting the support of the UN, I mean, it's on their radar, but obviously the more sort of public support there is behind these sort of solutions, then the more likely they are to happen, and political support as well. Even writing letters to your local politician could support us. There's loads of things that people can do to support us, absolutely.
Thank you so much for that. And I apologize to some of the folks who didn't get their questions answered. We had so many questions and unfortunately limited amounts of time, but maybe the two of you can direct some of our interested folks to where they can find more information or ask you in other ways.
I mean, sure. You can also contact us via Twitter, or in our webpage. There's also a little bit more information. So just get in touch.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Toby.
Thank you, Irene. That was fantastic. Thank you for joining us today. And Dr. Mar and John, thank you so much as well. It was really a great presentation. It was super exciting to learn more about Seafields. So best of luck, and look forward to staying in touch as you guys advance the project. But thank you again for being with us.
Thanks very much.
A couple programming notes about things we have coming up. Many of you have heard Open Air is engaging in a lobbying push for the Federal Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act. And some information here, Crystal put a link in the chat, but that's one place where Open Air can really use help wherever you live in North America and the United States. Next week on This Is CDR, we have a very exciting session with Drawdow, which is a Web3 project that Open Air will be involved with, and it'll be exciting to learn more about that. The 26th, we have Climate Robotics, which is basically a company that's making robots to do biochar in situ in fields. It's super interesting and exciting. One of Microsoft's recent carbon removal purchases. We have the CEO, Jason Arambu, to join us in a couple weeks. And then coming in August, we have Carbion, which is an XPRIZE award-winning, milestone award-winning DAC company out of the Netherlands. They were also they're very exciting. Carbofex, which is a Finnish-based biochar company, and then Travertine, which is one of Stripe's recent purchases, newly formed company to do CDR via mine waste, which is a super interesting pathway with a lot of potential. So thank you all again for being with us. Thank you to Dr. Marr and to John and to Irene for guest co-hosting and doing a great job with the Q&A. And then next week we have Drawdow with Matt Sniff and Charles Van Tassel, who are the founders, and they're going to talk about their Web3 project. And we'll also have a couple special guests, including a This Is CDR alum, who will talk about the inaugural Drawdow project. Thank you all for being with us. Have a great week, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.